The Victorian era was characterized by abundant strange habits and truly unusual customs. Some of them are so frightening that we should be thankful we were born in this era of history. Welcome to History Duck. Today I'm going to tell you about the creepiest things from the Victorian era which were considered completely normal for Victorians. So, let's dive into it. They held mummy unwrapping parties. If there's one thing creepier than having to remove a pharaoh's organs and mummify him to preserve his remains for centuries to come, it's unwrapping his body years later. However, the unwrapping of mummies became a macabre practice often attended by many of the upper class of the time. Since Europe of that period developed a special interest in ancient Egypt after Napoleon arrived in the country, this gave rise to a new fascination known as Egyptomania. As tourism in Egypt boomed, mummies began to be bought and sold everywhere. In fact, many of the wealthy visitors sought to take home a mummy as a souvenir of their travels. They would then organize an unwrapping party, sometimes in public places, but most of the time with their relatives and friends. Afterward, people would gather to witness the mummy's bandages removed, revealing what lay beneath: a smelly body that should have turned to dust hundreds of years ago. Nothing like a typical afternoon unwrapping mummies as a family. Taking pictures of the recently deceased. After a person passed away, their family used to spend money to take a picture of them. However, they didn't want a gruesome photograph of a lifeless deceased. Instead, the deceased were made up and dressed up and photographed in a position that made them look as if they were truly alive. Okay, this is really creepy. On certain occasions, some family members would pose with the deceased to have a last memory with the deceased. If it was a baby, they would sit him or her in a chair or between pillows to give the impression that he or she was alive. But in the case of the elderly, they kept them from using an incredibly effective post-mortem photographic support and creepy. The stand helped keep the subject's torso and head upright so the photographers could do their job. This alarming trend experienced a massive increase in the 19th century thanks to the rise of photographic technology. Even if it was a macabre trend, it also offered an excellent opportunity for families to take the last memory of their loved ones, especially if they had not had the chance to photograph them during their lifetime. However, that doesn't make it any less creepy. They electrocuted their own genitals. During the 19th century, electricity became increasingly used in everyday life, including in medicine. This practice came to be called electrotherapy, a treatment used to alleviate various problems such as muscle weakness or gout. The strangest part of this practice was the application of electric shocks to the genitals to treat numerous ailments such as impotence. To do this, Victorians would wear a belt around their waists and were literally electrocuted. These kinds of devices even came to be sold as a substitute for doctor visits. According to the people who promoted them, electric shocks were used to treat any ailment. From fatigue and migraines to depression and anxiety, there was no ailment that a good electric shock couldn't work. So yes, they basically paid to be electrocuted. Unfortunately, the belt didn't deliver what it promised. However, the Victorians believed that electricity was indeed curative because the brain focused on the pain of the electric shock rather than worrying about the other ailments present. The result of this? A few burns in exchange for a few seconds of distraction. They used cocaine to take care of their teeth. Cocaine was used as an ingredient in tooth powder, a product used to clean and polish teeth that were more common than toothpaste. But what is more disturbing was tooth drops, which were said to help soothe toothache in young children. The drops, partially or wholly made of cocaine, were sold and supplied legally and were quite effective, presumably because they helped keep the gums numb. They had hermits in their gardens. We all know that any good garden needs some gnomes. However, the Victorians took this concept further by having flesh and blood people living in their yards. hermits. Wealthy people hired hermits who, as you might imagine, dressed like druids and grew their hair, beards, and nails indefinitely. But of course, they were not real hermits, but people who were paid for their time. Possessing a garden hermit was a sign of one's economic power because it was required to have a garden large enough for an outsider to live in. It was also necessary to have a hut away from the main property where the hermit could stay, feed him, and pay him a salary. Among their duties, garden hermits served as a decorative element, but they also entertained the lords of the house and provided sage advice, just as a fantasy movie hermit would. They attended freak shows. Freak shows exhibited people suffering from oddities or diseases for the public's entertainment. Among these people exhibited were those who suffered from dwarfism or were extremely tall, possessed male and female sexual characteristics, or some other type of disease or extraordinary condition that might be shocking to the public. These exhibitions were held at traveling fairs, circuses, and taverns throughout England and were frequented by people from all walks of life. They stole corpses. It seems clear that the Victorians had some sort of fascination with lifeless bodies. However, on some occasions, they needed access to them for more practical purposes, the study of medicine. So it was that in the early 19th century, anatomy students were legally allowed to possess and dissect the bodies of those condemned to death. However, given that the average number of death row inmates was around 50 people per year, the number of cadavers that these students could access was really scarce, since medical schools needed around 500 bodies per year. This is why body snatching became much more frequent and became a new way to make a quick buck. Body snatchers would go to the nearest cemetery where, after digging up the newly buried bodies, they would sell them to local medical schools. This practice became so widespread that many people began to stake out the graves of their recently deceased relatives. Another day in the Victorian era. They ate disgusting food. Victorian cooking could be genuinely grisly. The poorer classes would accept anything they could get their hands on, including proxy, a generic term for any meat the butcher had for sale that had dropped dead from disease. Since sheep were highly susceptible to communicable diseases such as tetanus, ringworm, and salmonella, they were often sold as proxy meats. On the other hand, the working class ate jellied eels, a popular dish served on street carts, usually over the same bowl used by the previous customer. And of course, they also made use of any part of an animal they could salvage. From entrails to hearts and brains, there wasn't a single thing the Victorians weren't willing to use in their recipes. They used arsenic in their beauty products. One of the things the Victorians loved most was white skin. According to the beliefs of the time, it was believed that if you had a fair complexion, you would have a good marriage. However, most women could not resort to wearing excessive makeup since excessive use of makeup was considered bad taste. Instead, women with freckles, pimples, or blemishes would buy arsenic wafers to lighten their skin, which they would nibble on to make themselves pale. Still, all cosmetic products contained arsenic to a greater or lesser extent to serve this same purpose. However, the beauty industry was not the only industry in which this substance was used. Even wallpapers, dresses, toys, and medicines contained a certain amount of arsenic due to its incredibly cheap price. What the average Victorian did not know was that arsenic was a poison and, in fact, one of the most commonly used poisons at the time to commit murder. In 1851, the Arsenic Act was passed, which regulated the sale of arsenic and arsenic-containing products. Although it did not directly prohibit such products, it helped to minimize their risk considerably. They wore extremely tight corsets. When we say Victorian women wore extremely tight corsets, we don't mean the typical ones you've probably seen in the movies. Corsets were a popular item from the Victorian period used by most women looking to reduce their waistline. They employed a series of laces that helped tighten the area and hold any unwanted fat. And of course, they came in all sizes. However, things got out of hand after the appearance of too small corsets, even for the time. These tiny corsets caused damage to internal organs and made women look like completely unrealistic dolls because of a macabre fashion that we hope will not be repeated. Beauty hurts, but believe me, these garments hurt a lot more. That's all for now. See you in the next video with another interesting topic.